In today's journey, we are installing and setting up a CraftBeer Pi. We are using a Raspberry Pi that has a pre-existing Brew Pi legacy setup using the Brew Pi Remix protocol. Although these programs may seem similar, they are actually different in a lot of ways, and we recommend trying out both before fully committing to either. Before starting, we make sure that our Brew Pi legacy is working properly before restarting the Pi, which makes now a good time to let you know that we will be fast forwarding through some of the boring parts, such as waiting for the operating system to boot, and for Phil to realize that he can't copy and paste between the virtual terminal and his computer. Which kind of works out good because now he can show you the website, craftbeerpi.com. Click on the Install Now button and you'll be directed to a page that has all the information we need to complete this installation. The first thing you will need to do is make sure that you have Raspbian installed on your Raspberry Pi if this is the first thing you've ever installed on it. We are installing on top of an already existing Brew Pi Remix, so we don't need to do this. You can watch their video if you need to do this, or we have one over on our page. Just stop when you get to the part where we start to install the Brew Pi. And once again, like the Brew Pi, we don't need to worry about complicated nerd stuff. We just need to copy and paste a couple of lines of code and most of the dirty work will be done for us. We take this first bit of code, copy it, and paste it into the terminal. Once it's pasted, hit enter, and then it will automatically download all the files you need directly. And then we don't need to hunt down those files because the next couple of lines of code that we're going to copy and paste are going to run the program for us. And then we're going to just answer a few yes or no questions. We decided to be agreeable and just said yes to most of them. You may be able to alter it for your own setup, but we do always recommend to update whenever possible. Although we tend to get a little nervous to update once everything's installed and working. We got an error, but we ignored it and everything worked out fine. As for installing WirePi, that's important if you're going to use the GPIO pins for your controlling of the system. If you're unsure of what you're using to control the system, it's probably these. These are the pins that are sticking directly off of the Raspberry Pi themselves. And with that, the bulk of the install happens now. For us it took about 3 minutes, but we're using a Brew Pi B instead of a B+. The B Plus comes with about 10% overclock and a metal heat spreader over the main chip so that you can manage the heat better. Although Pis do not need heat spreaders or fans or anything for them to run, they can often run a bit better if you manage their heat. Otherwise, when you hit the thermal wall of about 90 degrees Celsius, you end up thermal throttling the chip and it slows down in order to save itself from burning out. Not a game ender, but we did notice that our chip was getting a bit warm and we are looking into cooling our Raspberry Pi. It's just a few more yes-no questions and we're off to the races. Activating the one-wire support is important if you're going to use the same DS18B20 style thermal probes that you used in your Brew Pi. We installed it anyways, but you probably don't need the Gembird USB support unless you actually bought it. You'd know if you needed it. And this last one is only important to say no if you're going to use your Raspberry Pi for other things. We have not only this one, but other ones dedicated to testing these systems 24 hours a day, so we set it to yes. That way if there's a power failure in our studio, we don't have to worry about restarting the program, it will do it automatically. And finally, we restart the Raspberry Pi to make sure everything installed properly and it is loaded up. We will then make sure that everything is updated to the most current version. This is done by using the code provided on CraftBeer Pi's website, on the same page that we got the rest of the code from earlier for the rest of the install. We just copy and paste this into the terminal and it'll do everything for us. Once we receive a message that says already up to date, Phil is finally okay with moving forward, which involves reopening the terminal that he just closed for some reason. Type out hostname, one word, space, -I. This is the nerdiest thing we've done all day, and it is very important that you type it in just so. We are hooked up to both wireless and wired connections, so we have 2 sets of numbers. Don't freak out if you only have one. Because we have a lot of wireless clients already, we are going to be using the wired IP address. If the shortcuts in Linux are messing with you, you can always right-click to do the copy and paste. It's dangerous to go alone, so take these numbers into your preferred web browser and paste them into the URL address bar. You will then need to add a colon followed by 5000 to access the CraftBeer Pi interface. And eventually, Phil will figure out how to use a keyboard. And that would bring us to the end of installing the software side of the CraftBeer Pi. It's at this point we would recommend to make sure that your hardware side is completely done. Conveniently, the people over at CraftBeer Pi make this super easy by having a hardware wiring page. There is a lot of customization that's available, but we recommend using this as a starting point. In our testing, we find that this system works far better with the SSRs drawn here instead of other relay setups, such as the relay board that's used in the Brew Pi setup. With that done, we can go back to the CraftBeer Pi user interface so that we can set up the software to properly talk to the hardware now. This is where things can either go simple or complicated depending on the setup that you need to use. We start out simple by just adding a brewery name. Next, we need to select our hardware type, and because we're just using the pins that come out the top, we pick GPIO. As for the thermometer type, we need the one-wire type. This refers to the fact that it only needs one wire to transmit data and that the other two are used for power. These are also the most common that you will see being used in the maker world. But this is where things start to get a little more complicated and you will need to customize for your own setup. We're already running a bit long, but we will give you a few pointers. This program gives you the ability to rename any of the thermometers or other hardware that's hooked up to the system. Take advantage of that as you will be using those names to program up how everything works later on. Don't actually click on the visibility box because that will hide it in the next window, although you may find reasons to use that later on. The thermometers will self-identify, but the other devices will need their GPIOs to be manually set. If devices that are on are off and off on, click on the invert box and that should fix your problem. Although you may have noticed by now that there is no section for any chilling or cooling devices, so sometimes you have to get a little clever. And because there's not a ton of documentation, you may have to do some trial and error. But with all of that set up, we can move on to the kettle section, which is going to assign what devices control what pots you plug them into, or fermentation vessels. Although you don't get to name the fermentation vessels. Not here anyways. Although this program is free to use, now is a good time to think about donating to the creator, who is not us and not affiliated with us in any way. But when you're ready to continue, click the Let's Go Brewing button. And once everything loads up, you will be able to see your temperatures, but not much else at this point. That's because it's waiting for all the pieces that we've set up to be told what to do and for what. One of the downsides to this program is that because it's so robust and how many options it has, it can be a bit intimidating to go through each and every one of them. But how to program the rest of this will have to wait for another video. Two main factors being, everyone's setup is going to be a little different, and two, we're going to need time to figure out how works best for us before we tell you how we set up ours.